Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome here to Bergen Kunsthal on this particularly wet and windy afternoon. There's a hurricane rolling in, but it's great that so many people have turned up, and as I say, I'd like to welcome you all here. My name's Martin Clark, and I'm the director at Bergen Kunsthal, and joining me here at this platform event, which has been organised on the occasion of the opening of the exhibition, The Noing Uv It, which opened last night downstairs in the galleries, I'm joined by Graham Harman and Stephen Claydon. So I'm just going to do a very short introduction for both Graham and Stephen, and then I'm going to say a few words about the exhibition and how it came into being. And then both Graham and Stephen are going to talk a little bit about their own practices, their very different practices, and then hopefully there'll be some time for discussion, and I'm definitely going to make sure there's time for questions from the audience at the end. So if you do have questions, please keep those, and I'll make sure that there's at least 10-20 minutes for people to ask questions at the end. So, first, Graham Harman. We're delighted to be joined here in Bergen by Graham, who has flown in from his home in Ankara. Graham is a philosopher, a writer. He's published numerous books around what has come to be known in the last few years as speculative realism, object-oriented ontology, something that Graham's been at the heart of developing as a kind of philosophical model and a way of thinking. His previously published books include Tool Being, Quadruple Object, Towards Speculative Realism, a collection of early essays. He was also a contributor to the Documenta catalogue for the last Documenta, and contributed an essay to that. And I think you have a book just published on Bruno Latour, Reassembling the Political, which is out now. And I understand that Graham is working on a book now around the Dutch East India Company, so we look forward to that when it comes out, and particularly the Dutch East India Company as a kind of object, a complicated object, but an object nonetheless. So we are delighted that you've been able to join us, Graham. I'm also joined by Stephen Claydon. Stephen Claydon is an artist who is based in London. He has shown widely all over the world in the last kind of 10, 15 years, I guess. Solo exhibitions that Steve has had include an exhibition at Haus de Kunst in 2010, a solo exhibition at First Sight in Colchester in 2012, and he's also been included in numerous group shows, including the British Art Show 7 in 2010, and has an upcoming solo exhibition in Geneva this September at the CAC. Stephen also curated an exhibition at the Camden Arts Centre in London in 2007, I think it was. It doesn't feel that long ago, but I checked and I think it was. And that was an exhibition called Strange Events Permit Themselves the Luxury of Occurring. And it was a very strange and beautiful and wonderful exhibition which I saw, and it was part of the impetus for me talking to Steve about coming in and co-curating this exhibition again. But we'll get onto that a little bit more. So, I'm going to just say a few words in just 5 minutes on the exhibition and how it developed and why, I guess. One of the ways that I work as a curator is, as a curator, you work in many, many different ways with artists, and every time you work with an artist, it's a different kind of relationship. And often you work a bit like a producer with that person, sometimes a bit like an editor, sometimes more like a collaborator, sometimes simply a sort of facilitator or something. Oh, sorry. I'm crackling. I hope that's better, yeah. But every so often, I think, for me at least, it's very exciting to take a more authorial and perhaps a more narrative approach to exhibition making. And I've now made a few exhibitions over the last 10 odd years where I've developed large-ish group exhibitions like the one downstairs that have been much more personal and have been drawn much more out of my own kind of research and kind of interests. And I think I've thought a lot about group exhibitions in that time and about the way that group exhibitions are made, and good practice in making group exhibitions, I guess. And for me, one of the things is always to be trying to follow the work. So rather than the impetus for these exhibitions coming from some very personal interest or piece of research that I'm doing, it normally comes from looking at art. It comes from looking at what artists are doing at the moment, what they're making. And often, you know, in the course of my work, I see a lot of artists and I see a lot of work, and you'll find different works and different artists clustering together in your mind somehow. And part of what I think the job of the curator is to try and unpick that and to try and think, why is it that I happen to be thinking about that artist and that artist and that artist right at this moment? What is it that means that that work feels like it has some kind of currency or some kind of urgency somehow? And that was really the starting point for this exhibition. It was looking at a number of practices, not just contemporary artists, well, it's all contemporary, but not just artists who are making work right now, but also some more historic works, which seemed to feel like they had a real urgency or currency at the moment. And so I began thinking about this, and at the same time I was thinking about this, I was working on an essay for another artist called Simon Ling. And in the course of working on that essay, I began reading some of Graham's work. And what struck me when I began reading Graham's work was that in the course of his philosophical writing, he was talking both about ideas, but also using language and speaking in a way which felt like it resonated very strongly with some of the ideas and some of the thinking that I was interested in these artists' practice. And I think it's important to say that most of these artists weren't aware of Graham's work or the wider kind of object-oriented ontology at that point. But there seemed to be a kind of simultaneity to these two things. There seemed to be an interesting kind of parity. And I was also working on an interview with Stephen Claydon for his catalogue that he made for First Sight with Michelle Cotton. And through those conversations, we first began talking. I think Steve had recently also come across some of this writing. So I thought it would be interesting to think about making an exhibition that brought together some of these artists and practices in the sort of vicinity of some of this writing and thinking, not to illustrate each other or not to reduce one or the other to each other, but simply to open up that space and to see what might happen. But this was about 3 years ago, and actually in the course of the last 3 years, there have been quite a number of exhibitions that have done just this, and have been more or less explicitly talking about speculative realism and object-oriented ontology in relation to aesthetics, and particularly contemporary art. So it's there, and it's part of the discourse at the moment. So as I began working on this exhibition, Stephen actually came in about 1.5 years ago. And through these conversations, I invited Steve to make the exhibition with me and to co-curate the show. And I was delighted that he accepted that invitation. But we were very clear at that point that we didn't want to make a show about speculative realism or about object-oriented ontology, but that we still thought there was a really extraordinary dialogue to be had somehow, or an exhibition to make which could contribute to that discourse somehow. And actually, one of the great things that happened was that about 6 months ago, we began talking about a book, a novel called Ridley Walker. And this was a novel that was written in the late 1970s and published in 1980 by an American author called Russell Hoban. And it's a novel that's set 2,000 years after a nuclear apocalypse when civilization has been basically wiped out. And there's a very primitive society that is emerging now, some 2,000 years later, out of the ruins of this land and this culture. And the whole book is written in a very broken down, worn down vernacular. It's a kind of form of English, but it's like a phonetic English. If you've lost everything, if you've lost all books and information and written word, if you've lost a culture, then what remains is the spoken word. And what emerges over that long period of time is a form of English that is now much more broken down. Many of the words Hoban breaks into two parts. And this theme of breaking something open recurs through that book over and over again. And there's a kind of mythology that's developed within this book where this nuclear apocalypse, this event, is remembered as the splitting of something, the splitting of the atom. Except they confuse it with Christian theology, so they call it the little man, the Adam. So the atom becomes Adam, the first man. And they found fragments of religious kind of painting, so they've seen the image of the crucifix and the crucified Christ with his arms outstretched. But in their mythology, they now weave it into this idea of him being pulled apart, split apart. So they call him the little shining man, the Adam. And so that becomes this secret withdrawn, hidden thing that's at the heart of everything, this reality, this kind of flickering building block that sits behind the visible at a certain kind of scale and which animates everything somehow. So that became a really interesting idea for Steve and I, who were also thinking about some of these ideas of the duality of objects and the split between an object and its image, and the split in language between a word as a signifier and what it signifies, this idea. Maybe we should, I'm going to stop talking in a minute and we'll get onto some of this. It means it's necessarily not an easy show to sum up, as I've just demonstrated, going on and on and on like that. But what I think's so valuable is that occasionally you have the opportunity to do those shows which are more complex and more complicated. And they're not more complex and more complicated for the sake of it. It's because you're trying to produce a space which allows for a very productive proliferation of readings and experiences. And I think the show in some ways is about objects, but it's as much about language. Steve has described it as this kind of giant roving concrete poem. And I think it's a really interesting way to think about it. But one of the things at the heart of the show is this idea that, you know, things, objects, stuff, when you bring it into a kind of orbit with other things, they activate each other and they do something. And it's different from when you're looking at them as a little JPEG on your computer screen or thinking about them or talking about them. So we wanted to make something that is necessarily difficult to talk about because it's a kind of another kind of language. It's a language of materiality and objects and things. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to ask Graham now to talk for a few minutes to introduce his own work and his own thinking, and then we can pick up after that.
Okay, I've been using the term object-oriented philosophy since the late 1990s, and it was originally a joke. I was playing, of course, on object-oriented programming, computer science, which I don't know very well. I simply like the name, and I stole the name for my own purposes. And to my surprise, that name caught on, so I'm stuck with that name now. You never know which terms you throw out there that become popular. So from then on, 1999 or so, I've been doing object-oriented philosophy. Now, by object, I don't mean what it sometimes means in artistic discourse, which means a solid object that's durable, as opposed to performances or events or concepts. Object for me is simply the broadest possible term. Philosophy has a very broad mandate, of course. We're supposed to talk about everything that exists in some sense. And so for me, an object is just about anything. It can be cartoon characters, it can be this table, it can be the Dutch East India Company, which I'm writing a book on now. The only thing a thing needs to be an object is to be irreducible in two directions. If something is completely reducible to what it's made of, then it's not an object, and if it's completely reducible to its effects, it's not an object. Now, those are the two ways we have of knowing things. If somebody asks you what something is, you're going to give one of two kinds of answers. You're going to tell them what it's made of, or you're going to tell them what it does, or how it looks. And I've often called these two tendencies undermining and overmining. Undermining is when you break a thing down by talking about the ultimate pieces it's made of. Overmining, when you talk about what a thing does, what its pragmatic sense is. Now, neither of those is philosophy. I hold that philosophy is not a kind of knowledge. Philosophy is not an explanation of anything. And you can find this all the way back in Socrates. And the term philosophia itself, which means love of wisdom, not wisdom. It's something you can never attain. Socrates never gives us any definitions of love or friendship or virtue. He's simply finding inadequacies in all the definitions that have been given. He's getting closer and closer to something. He's never replacing an object by definition of it. He's never paraphrasing an object, as literary critics would say. Now, what makes philosophy and the arts so closely related, in my opinion, is the fact that both cannot paraphrase their objects. Art is producing objects, in my wide sense, not necessarily a physical object, but something that is not simply reducible to what it's made of, or reducible to the impression somebody has of it, or to the pragmatic significance it has in a certain context. There's something self-contained about the art object, just as there is something self-contained about the object for philosophers. So if art produces objects, philosophy is the general theory of objects, I would say. And this cuts against the grain of some tendencies in contemporary philosophy to view philosophy as the ally of mathematics. I'm thinking here of Alain Badiou and Quentin Meillassoux, who both think that mathematics gives us access to the primary qualities of things. Badiou goes so far as to say that set theory is ontology. There is no ontology other than set theory, whereas Meillassoux says the primary qualities of a thing are the ones that can be mathematized and are therefore deeper than the senses. I disagree with both of those things. The mathematical is that which is knowable, whereas for me the object is precisely that which is not knowable. I got a lot of this from Heidegger, who was somebody I spent a lot of time with in my student years. For Heidegger, of course, the reality of a thing withdraws behind its surface presence to us. A thing is always deeper than any way that it might appear. This is the being of the thing. There are a couple of problems with this, however. One of them is that Heidegger remains within Kant's tradition. Kant, of course, talked about the fact that humans do not have access to the things in themselves. We only have access to the world in human terms. Why? Because we experience things in space and time. We don't really know if space and time exist outside the mind for Kant. We know that humans must experience things in space and time. There are also the 12 categories of the understanding, one of which is cause and effect, the easiest to explain. Kant says we can't know for sure if there's really cause and effect outside the mind or if things happen randomly, but we can be sure that humans must experience the world in terms of things happening according to causal sequences. Now, the problem with this, as I see it, is that Kant has the thing in itself there, which I think is good, but it's only something that haunts poor human beings. We humans can never touch the things in themselves, and there's always this extra thing out there we can't reach. What about object-object interactions? Kant's Critique of Pure Reason was published in 1781, which is not that long ago in philosophy. Philosophy is the slowest moving of fields. You can think of this as a contemporary book still in many ways. We're all working in Kant's shadow for the last 234 years. Well, one of the problems with the kind of philosophy that is the era of Kant today is that it tends to leave object-object interactions to the sciences. It's assumed that the sciences are handling inanimate causal interactions well enough. And so humans create this taxonomical space for themselves. We're going to talk about the human stuff. The sciences can talk about these things. We're going to talk about interpretations and societies and language. But the sciences don't leave us alone for long, because now you get someone like Thomas Metzinger who comes along and says that neuroscience can explain all these things better than philosophy. But don't worry, philosophers, we still need you for ethics panels. There's still some use for you. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with ethics panels, but I think we have a much bigger mission than that. We can talk about the interaction of inanimate things in a different way from the sciences. For example, if I look at a cotton ball, I'm not exhausting the cotton ball. I'm objectifying it according to the senses that I have as a human. I'm smelling it in a certain way based on previous smells, odors that I've smelt. So I am distorting or caricaturing the cotton ball when I perceive it. I'm not getting direct access to the cotton ball. But if you take the great example from Islamic philosophy, which I've learned a lot of in Cairo, and think about the situation of a flame burning the cotton. The flame is also not interacting with all aspects of the cotton. The flame is dealing with the flammability of the cotton, not with the smell of it, the softness of it, and so forth. So inanimate objects do not make direct contact with each other any more than we do. It follows from my idea that an object cannot be reduced to its parts or to its effects, that we cannot have knowledge of the object. We can at best have indirect knowledge of the object. We can allude to the object. We can make allusive statements. There's a certain allure of the object, to use another related word, that summons us to it, that we can never quite put into words. Let me give you an example from wine tasting. Daniel Dennett, who is one of the most reductionistic analytic philosophers in America, thinks that wine tasters are worthless. Because if a wine taster says, for example, this is a flamboyant and velvety Pinot, but lacking in stamina, Dennett says that's ridiculously pretentious. What you need to do is pour your wine into a machine and it spits out the chemical formula. That's real wine tasting. Well, I think we all would agree that there's something lost when you do that. There's something lost. And yes, wine tasters can be pretentious. That's the risk they run, just as art critics can be pretentious, literary critics can be pretentious, but you're probably not going to meet a pretentious physicist. You might meet a narrow-minded physicist or a dogmatic physicist, but you're not going to find a pretentious scientist. Why? Because it's the job of scientists to replace names of objects by lists of true properties or qualities that belong to that object. Their job is to paraphrase an object in terms of literal words. This is not what we do in philosophy or the arts. You cannot replace an artwork. I cannot go down to the show downstairs and remove the works and replace them with typed prose descriptions, no matter how elegant the prose might be. You're going to be losing something if you do that. Whereas you're not going to be losing much if you say, by electron, I mean the following properties. This is what you do in the sciences. You've done your work as a science when you replace a name by a list of qualities. If you do that in the arts, or if you do it in wine tasting, as Dennett tried to do, you've ruined the exercise. And the same with philosophy. Imagine you were to summarize Nietzsche's philosophy. Look up Nietzsche's philosophy on Wikipedia, and you're going to see a very banal list of literal statements. Nietzsche believed everything was about a struggle for power, and he was against democracy, and you'd find 5 or 6 points. They're not inaccurate, but you're losing what's magical about Nietzsche, which is the style, the force with which he makes the statements. You've done him an injustice, and the same would happen for any artwork. You cannot really replace any artwork by a prose description. Now, the catalog I wrote for Documenta was about, I call it the third table, the catalog essay, the third table. It's referring to Sir Arthur Stanley Eddington, who used to be more read than he is today. Eddington is most remembered in history. He was an English astronomer who verified Einstein's general theory of relativity by taking some measurements of an eclipse. One of the differences between Einstein's theory of gravity and Newton's is that Einstein's predicted the curvature of starlight as it came near the sun. And of course, you can't usually see this during the daytime because the stars near the sun are invisible. The sun is too bright. So you have to wait for an eclipse. And this was the first visible eclipse following Einstein's publication of his theory. And Eddington found that Einstein's theory was in fact correct. The starlight had moved closer to the sun, which wouldn't have been expected under Newton's theory. This was the moment when Einstein became a household name. Before that, he was known among scientists. He became a public figure with the publication of these findings to the Royal Society in London. Now, Eddington, though, also used to be read for his Gifford lectures in Edinburgh, which talk about philosophy and religion each year. And he began with a famous metaphor of the two tables that philosophers used to talk about a lot. And so let's say this is the table, more of a stool, but coffee table maybe. He said, I'm writing my lectures at this table, but it's actually two tables. One of the tables, the one that science talks about, is mostly empty space, and it's made of swarming particles that I can't see. It's not really solid as I think it is, and that's the first table. And since he's a physicist, that's the one he prefers. But there's also this second table. The second table is the practical table that we can put things on, we can move it around into different rooms. Martin could sell it to me if I wanted it as a souvenir of this meeting. Lots of practical things can happen with this table. It's hard, I can lean on it, it's not empty space. Now, what occurred to me as I was writing this essay is that neither of those is the real table. Those two tables that Eddington describes are the two that I think are not the real table. Those are two reductions of the table. You can say what it's made of, yes, but you cannot reduce the table to what it's made of because you can remove some of those atoms, you can add new ones, and no one's going to notice within a certain, if you took all the particles away, there's no table, yes. But within certain limits, you can make changes. So a table is not utterly identifiable with all the particles that make it up in their exact positions at any given moment. Neither is the table its current practical use for us right now, because we could be using it for something else completely different. The third table is something like a form in between those two that is neither completely reducible to the first table nor downward, nor completely reducible to the second table upward. It's a third table in between the two, and my thesis in that essay was that this third table is what artists are always already creating. You failed if you create an artwork that is simply an aggregate of physical materials. You have failed if you create an artwork that is too easily interpretable by the first comer, that doesn't have anything there that's resisting you, that doesn't have a life of its own. I'm sure you found when arranging all the pieces in this show or any other that certain pieces want to be in certain places. As I said earlier, I admire where Sarah Lucas's furniture has been placed right there. It seems like the right place to put it. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't have thought of that, but it's a very nicely placed object right now. So for me, the artwork, just like philosophy, is about this third object in between the two that cannot be reduced in either direction. And let me just say one more thing to connect this to the arts more concretely. I've been writing more and more about the arts and architecture, partly because artists and architects invite me more than philosophers do. That's an interesting phenomenon in its own right. I like to think that's because artists and architects are under pressure to innovate in a way that philosophers are not. Philosophy moves so slowly that it can easily border on history of philosophy when we're commenting on a Kant or Heidegger or someone else. Whereas the arts and architecture, you cannot do that. You have to be making things all the time, and you can't just be repeating what others have done. So I like to think that people are finding speculative realism interesting for innovative purposes in the arts. We'll see. Time will tell. I've written a number of pieces on Clement Greenberg. Now, at first glance, it should look like Greenberg's philosophy of art, his criticism, should be a very good match for speculative realism, or at least for object-oriented philosophy, because he's trying to talk about the thing as something disconnected from its surroundings, something that has an autonomy, some self-contained character. The biographical and social-political context of the work doesn't matter for Greenberg, just as for formalist literary critics. The object has a certain inner life. Now, in that sense, there's a kinship. However, I don't like the results that Greenberg draws from this, and I'll tell you why. He makes a criticism. He makes the same criticism of both Dada and Surrealism, and I think he's making a mistake here. What he says is that his real enemy is not kitsch. His real enemy is academic art. And what he says about academic art, he defines it in a late lecture in Australia. He says academic art is art that is unaware of its medium, which Marshall McLuhan would have loved. Marshall McLuhan thinks the medium is what's important, the background medium, not the content of a medium. And what Greenberg was really despising, if you think of late 19th century academic painting in France or elsewhere, these people are simply going on autopilot, painting more and more three-dimensional illusionistic scenes as if viewed from the window, like we've been doing ever since the Renaissance. And of course, he thinks this starts to change with Manet. That's where he places modernism and its beginning. And he says a good example of academic art is surrealism, particularly Dali. Now, I can see why Greenberg says this, because Dali is not really innovating in terms of medium. He's innovating in terms of content. There's crazy content, but it's still your 19th century academic illusionistic technique. So I can understand his point there. Then he goes on to say that Duchamp is also an academic artist. Now that is a little harder to make that case, because if there's anyone who's questioning the medium of arts, it's surely Duchamp. So that same critique can't be made in both places, I don't think. There's another problem, though, which is that what Greenberg sees as positive about modern art is that it's aware of the fact that painting takes place on a flat background canvas, and so any content that you find in the painting is simply signaling its awareness of that fact. So his heroes turn out to be Picasso and Braque in the Cubist period, Mondrian, Miro, and then some of the later people, Pollock, Olitsky, Noland. These are the heroes of modern art for Greenberg, of course. So content he normally identifies with mere literary anecdote, as he calls it. Literary anecdote's a bad thing. Painting isn't supposed to be telling a story. It's supposed to be purely formal, and it's alerting us to the reality of the background medium. I think he falls into the same problem here as Heidegger. Heidegger, the philosopher of being, the person who says that surface is a mere presence at hand and you need to get deeper to get to the being. That part I agree with. There's another problem with Heidegger, though, which is that he tends to view multiplicity merely as a matter of the surface. So if you're talking about individual beings for Heidegger, you're automatically on the surface as well. You have to be talking about the single unified being to be talking about the backgrounds. If you look at Heidegger's own contribution to the philosophy of arts, The Origin of the Work of Art, this famous essay, he talks about art as a strife between the hidden earth and the visible worlds. Here again, the earth is a single background condition for Heidegger. There aren't many earths. Whereas it seems to me quite the contrary, that it's not the case that there's a single shared background for all paintings or even within the same painting. Individual elements within a painting. I'm talking about painting here because that's Greenberg's favorite topic. We could apply this argument to other media as well. There's a multiplicity of elements within any painting, and each of these must have an individual background, and Greenberg cannot account for this any better than Heidegger can. And this, I think, is one of the ways to save surrealism from Greenberg's critique. Why? Because, as Greenberg even admits about Dali's painting, Dali needed to maintain a traditional medium in order to make the content interesting. If you were to do a Dali painting and redo it with an analytic cubist style, it would simply be too intellectually busy. It would be too confusing. Like imagine a Dali painting like The Ghost of Vermeer of Delft, which can also be used as a table. I don't know if you know this one. The guy has the long skinny leg and there's a tray on it. Imagine that in analytic cubist style. There would just be all these planes, and with those kinds of analytic cubist paintings, you need simple objects. You need candlesticks and violins and sitting men, because a complicated object would draw your attention away from the formal innovations, and vice versa with surrealism. You couldn't really have a surrealist painting that was anything more than traditional academic illusionism. So I mention this point because surrealism and Dada are often packaged together as the same movement, and they have overlapping members, and they have a shared sense of humor in some sense. But in a sense, you could think of Dada and surrealism as experiments using opposite control variables. They're doing the opposite things in a sense. And surrealism may be easier to match up with science fiction. And we had an interesting discussion about science fiction the other night. My favorite quote by the late J.G. Ballard was when he said in that research volume of interviews and discussions with Ballard that the role of the artist has changed in our time. And he must have said this in the 80s, I think. In the past, the artist was called upon to produce fictions. Now we're completely surrounded by fictions. We're surrounded by video games, advertisements, conspiracy theories. We're surrounded by nothing but fictions. So according to Ballard, the task of the artist now is to produce realities, produce credible realities. And one of the advantages of something like surrealism is that it helps create that credible reality by maintaining the traditional representational structure and simply varying the content that's within it. A book like Ridley Walker isn't so experimental in its prose as it produces a plausibly degenerate English of the future after civilization has collapsed. It produces a plausible landscape because it's the Kent that we know of, simply distorted both by nuclear war and accidents and other geographical changes. And so there's a certain reality principle usually left there in science fiction that by making small modifications to, you can create something very unsettling and new without asking too much of the viewer or the reader. There's a pre-given reality structure there. And this is one avenue that I think was unexplored in post-Greenbergian criticism, because most of the reaction against Greenberg, of course, was from the Dadaist side. There hasn't been as much of an attempt to confront Greenberg's legacy on the surrealist side, and I've tried to argue that those are two opposite things. I'll stop my remarks there.
Thank you. There's a lot in what you've said, Graham, that would be great to follow up on, but what I'd like to do now is maybe just pass over to Steve. And I don't know, I mean, it would be great to hear you talk a little bit about your practice, but I know when you said, Graham, that a lot of this stuff for you many years ago came out of your very detailed and engaged reading of Heidegger.
Right.
Certainly, one of the starting places when I started looking at Stephen's work and when we began talking was also Heidegger, and this is again about 10 or 11 years ago in this case. And I know it's someone that you've thought about a lot, and that you've thought about that, particularly that essay, the work of art, a lot as well. So maybe that's a nice place to start.
Yeah, I'm busy digesting everything that's just been said for the last half an hour. But yeah, I mean, I was similarly dissatisfied with that explanation, and but I'm totally kind of sympathetic to Heidegger, and I really enjoy the kind of aesthetic of his prose and the whole kind of original way he tries to encounter the sum of thought and how we think about objects, but specifically objects. And I thought I saw something in that essay that he'd kind of touched on, or he was too nervous to go near in that late phase of his writing because it would kind of put in jeopardy everything else he'd sort of written, and that there is some kind of strobing between these multiple realities between the earth and the world, and like you say, that there isn't some kind of wholeness of some background matter. It's much more sort of fragmented, and that held with a lot of things I'd always thought about artworks, that they are a kind of climate in a way, which with all these orbiting signifiers that kind of aggregate around objects, and I'd originally started thinking about that in relation to a description that Joseph Conrad gives of a story, or what a good story is, and he objectifies this whole kind of idea, and he talks about the yarns of seamen, and he thinks that these long shaggy dog stories that sailors are traditionally told are the best kinds of stories, because they weave, and he likens it to a nut. They weave this sort of story through all these different signifiers around and create this shell, but you never see the kernel. The center is unknowable, you can't touch it, but the kind of story, the subjective nature of it sort of weaves around this void. And so through those kind of avenues, I've always just been trying to understand what it is I do as an artist, or what art is, especially in the light of some of those Greenbergian ideas, and not being satisfied with anything really. Like you said about Ballard, really what would be nice to do is to create not nice to do, what's important for artists is to create an original encounter. And I think people used to call that kind of truth, but really it's just to kind of keep open, or hold open the openness, and keep it there, is what Heidegger said an artwork does. And he makes a kind of special dispensation for an artwork as opposed to other kinds of tools, I think. And that's what I was interested in. And I think, yeah, that's what I'm interested in my practice, is to throw up material. I suppose I used to talk about it as a kind of hadron collider, but it would have to be sort of multiple hadron colliders, taking objects and signifiers and forcing an equivalence, arresting that equivalence, and then seeing what kind of symptomatic material comes out of it. And hopefully, if an artwork is operative, it can carry on sort of spitting out this strobing and spitting out this material well after the artist has produced it. And that there's this kind of interaction with other objects, with other environments, and that there's some kind of operative utility in a thing outside of its kind of what the artist intends for it, or even what we project onto things. Like we certainly potentize things to a large degree, but just kind of projecting a kind of anthropocentric or subjective character onto a thing doesn't really say that much about the thing. I think it's much more reciprocal. I think there's a kind of reciprocity or even a confederacy between things and thoughts and objects and chemical reactions. I often think about, think about neurons and photons and carrier particles. I think of light as objects. But I also think about all of these things, especially in relation to this book and this show, a sort of kind of haptic linguistics, if you like, a kind of a language between things that you can't reduce or reproduce. It's a, I suppose, what people call a hunch or something, and I also sometimes refer to that. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself as a kind of secular animism, if you like. Kind of.
It's interesting that one of the starting points when we were first beginning to talk about Graham's work as well a couple of years ago was that kind of idea that you had about this kind of flickering nature of objects and the way that you talked about the kind of the withdrawn or the hidden reality of something in terms of the carapace and the shell. And I'm thinking about some of the other ways that you've talked about. Whenever we've had these conversations, we've always, even though it's just the two of us, said, not in this kind of hippie, animistic way. It's not about a new kind of metaphysics, but there is something, and it became a really important conversation in the show around a kind of evolution of consciousness, or an idea that that when you approach things, talking about science and physics, and the reality at a quantum level is very different to the kind of anthropocentric reality that we have access to. And so this isn't to talk about some kind of animistic, shamanistic metaphysics, but it's to talk about, is there access to another kind of reality which is very, very strange, and which science tells us objectively is very, very strange and doesn't obey the normal laws of physics that we've all been taught at school and grown used to. And I know that one of the other people that you talked to me about was a physicist called David Bohm, and his idea of the is it the concealed and the
implicate order,
the
implicate order,
implicate
exactly.
and explicate,
implicate and explicate. But I don't know whether you wanted to say something about that.
I think you just did. But yes, I think we were talking about consciousness as something that might already be in some primitive form be inherent within matter, and Bohm came up with this idea that he'd sort of adopted from this neurologist called Carl Pribram, that there might be some kind of holographic way that via interference patterns that memory is stored in the brain over the whole of the brain, and Bohm went on to think that maybe on a quantum level that this information is spread throughout matter. And I like the idea that he that there might be this consciousness, but we tried to allude to that in the show with this trilobite fossil, and trilobites were the most successful animals on the planet for hundreds of millions of years, and they were some of the first animals to develop these quite elaborate eyes for sensing light, usually to get away from a predator or to predate. And one of the things we've discussed is for hundreds of millions of years, for billions of years, since eternity, that these kind of light was hitting objects and chemical reactions were making color and all of these things, but there was nothing to receive that information, and that the eye evolved to do just that, but it didn't mean that those reactions weren't happening. And I suppose Bohm is trying to think in a similar way, that there might actually be a kind of innate consciousness, as it were, without trying to sound too hippie, but that I suppose we're only just being able to sort of touch on that in quantum physics and in philosophy, and I think that there's something in art, I think, that tries to touch on that hidden character.
And I think this also touches on some of the things that you said. And, in a very basic way, if you try and think about object-object relations and you remove the subjectivity, the anthropocentric subjectivity, which actually for billions of years wasn't there and could potentially be not there for billions more years, how do you think of philosophy? How do you think things and stuff and matter and material if you remove that human subjectivity and that, just that idea of the evolution of the eye being such a kind of specific and special event that evolves in response to this stuff that's been bouncing around in the universe for billions of years and then could be lost?
Well, it makes time seem ridiculous as well when you think about that. Time is a variable that's important to us with spinning around on our planet and our, for instance, our number of heartbeats that determines how long we live, and all of these kind of ultimately anthropocentric perspectives are kind of thrown out the window when you try to think about things in more epochal, or time isn't really relevant to a lot of things. You could replace that variable with gravity, and you could suggest that maybe gravity is much more of an important variable. And I think these kind of, you can usually think about things in 4 dimensions, but you can just swap out some of those variables.
I want to bring Graham in a moment to turn this into more of a conversation as well, but while you're here, and I think it would be really nice to, we have this work reinstalled downstairs, the fictional pixel and the ancient set, and a lot of that work you've already talked about, just talking about your practice in general, but I think particularly these references to kind of pre-Socratic thinking, it would be nice, maybe you could just say a little bit about those 2 videos which are shown together in this kind of environment, and then we can open it up a little bit more.
Yeah, the works were made in 2008 and originally shown as a pair at the Serpentine Pavilion in London. And since then I've shown them in different settings, in different kind of configurations and arrays in various parts of the world. Most recently, I think, in Lofoten during LIAF Biennale in the Arctic Circle. So that was a kind of, it's always strange when you take an object and redeploy it, or take a set of objects and redeploy them. But the film came about really in the way I was talking about arresting an equivalence. I think humans are hardwired to make relationships, and I wanted to take a lowest common denominator like a pixel. A pixel is part of an image that we're asked to kind of suspend our disbelief to look at to get involved in the spectacle of the moving image. But it's made up of these discrete units. And the word pixel comes from a contraction of the word picture and a contraction of the word element, and it's a compound of those. So pixel was first used, and if you see the film, it sort of describes that in images that were being sent from the first lunar expeditions. But I've always been interested in pre-Socratic philosophy, primarily because I'm not that bothered with ethics, and I was always interested in the idea of natural philosophy, of people just trying to, in that what we see as a very sort of distant and primitive environment, trying to reason how things come into being. And specifically, in this instance, Democritus, who came up with the idea of the uncuttable, irreducible corpuscle, if you like, or atom. And this is a kind of playful way of talking about that I rested these things together. But often I use lowest common denominator objects like bricks or pixels in order to talk about complexity and the sometimes the absurd way that humans create meaning where there might be none, but also to kind of ask the question about, if you make a cursory equivalence, whether that, the material that comes out of that, even if it's done as some kind of ingest, if you like, if it's done as some kind of experiment to to highlight how ridiculous those kind of conclusions are, that it still stuff comes out of it. It still kind of has this kind of fusis, this kind of suppurating narrative piles out of it, and how less creative is that are those conclusions than a kind of logical kind of model where in structural philosophy or in anthropology, where we try to make very scientific conclusions, how less credent are these conclusions that you can draw from an arrested, absurd equivalence. And I think that's what happens a lot in art, is that we try to draw things into the field of inquiry that seem totally discrete or unrelated. And certainly in things like science fiction that we were talking about earlier, that happens.
I don't know whether you want to respond to any of that, Graham.
I really enjoyed the pre-Socratic elements in Steve's films. The pre-Socratics have been important for me as well, although in some sense critically, because for me they are the ones who undermine the mid-sized objects by replacing them with smaller things. But certainly they're very important as the foundation of Western philosophy and science. I was actually going to respond to something about the quantum theory, which is that the usual way that quantum theory is employed by philosophers, both, say, Slavoj Žižek or Karen Barat are two examples of this, is that it somehow shows for these people that the mind helps create the world. The world is co-constructed by the mind. And I wasn't sure I had a good argument about that until I was paired up with Anton Zeilinger, the Austrian physicist, at the last document of her discussion. And he said something that I haven't forgotten. He said, maybe the right way to think of quantum theory is you're putting an object in a quantum state by subtracting it from its relations. And see, relationality is such an important popular concept now in the social sciences as well as in philosophy. The idea that things are created by their context, nothing has an independent existence. I don't think that really works. If you think, for example, of Bruno Latour, who is the most relational philosopher I can think of working right now, this idea that a thing is only what it does. A thing is whatever it transforms, modifies, perturbs, or creates, Latour puts it. I think he starts realizing later in his career that that doesn't really help us explain change. Aristotle already had to posit that there was this thing hidden behind a thing's current actual state that allows it to become something new in the future. This is what he called potentiality, and the concept has been with us ever since. This idea that the thing is a mysterious core or nucleus that is not ever fully expressed in any given moment, I think needs to be retained. So I would actually put a different spin on the importance of quantum theory for philosophy than many philosophers do.
One of the things we talked about recently, after watching a couple of, we both watched that lecture, didn't we, about by a physicist, and we were thinking about quantum theory and the way that we observe, or we kind of observe, well, I don't observe them, but somebody observes particles, and that they will appear here and then appear there and appear at the back of the room, but they don't. There's no kind of.
Don't pass through space.
They don't pass through space. They just appear in a kind of progression, if you like, and what happens to them in between those states, whether they kind of fill the whole of the space, or and then reduce back down, or whether they just are in a different parallel dimension in that time. And there's lots of theories about what might happen to those particles in between their appearance in our kind of the way we observe them. But this guy was talking about just this problem of the anthropocentric. He was talking about, he called it monkey logic. He said that we can't ever really understand particles unless we start to think like particles, and it's virtually impossible for us to do that, and we will have to build machines that are able to do that, to help us to better understand this very complex and mysterious realm, and it's kind of depressing, but absolutely kind of fascinating.
Along with anthropocentrism, which I'm fully against, there's another concept, the Anthropocene, which isn't exactly the same thing, because the Anthropocene, as geologists discuss it, is not saying that the world is human-centered, but quite the opposite, that humans are very vulnerable to what happens. So in a sense, even though it's formed the same way, Anthropocene means almost the opposite of the anthropocentric. And this becomes relevant in an art context, at least for the following reason. Michael Fried, I mentioned Greenberg, now I'll talk about Michael Fried a bit. What Michael Fried said he didn't like about minimalism, we have a nice piece by Albert Morris here in this show, were two different things that I don't think go together, that Fried thinks are both true of minimalism. One of them is literalism, the idea that the minimalists think they can just put a literal object in your path and it's art automatically, a concrete block or a metallic frame on the wall. He said also this is theatrical, because since the artwork loses any autonomous aesthetic character, its only possible effect can be the rhetorical, theatrical effect it has on you. And so therefore the artwork needs to have no effect on the viewer whatsoever. I think these are two separate things completely. And the best way I could show this is by referring to something Manuel de Landa said in his book on the philosophy of society, 2006. De Landa in this book said that he's searching for a concept of society apart from humans, because he's a realist philosopher. What is society like apart from humans? And of course you could say that's a ridiculous notion, because human society needs humans, therefore it's impossible to talk about human society without humans. And de Landa says, no, it's not. All I'm saying is we want to talk about society independent of how it's conceptualized by humans at any given point in the evolution of sociology. So even if humans causally create human society, that doesn't mean that we transparently understand human society the way Vico thought we could understand anything that's human because we made it. Quite the contrary. Human things are often much harder to understand than things in nature. Do we really understand society or government better than we understand electrons? I strongly doubt it. So the fact that humans created it is a different question from whether or not the human conception exhausts it. And it seems to me that Fried is conflating those two things when he criticizes minimalism, because on the one hand he's saying there has to be a depth to the works that's not equivalent to how we humans conceptualize it. But on the other hand, he seems to be saying humans have to be completely outside of the picture, and art must be art even if no humans are present. So even if all humans were exterminated, all of the works downstairs would be art, and I don't think that's a plausible view. I think the human is a necessary ingredient in the art, or in architecture even more so, because humans have to actually inhabit it. It does not follow that whatever humans think about the art happens to be true. And so I think that maybe we can use the term Anthropocene this way, that art is Anthropocene without being anthropocentric. When we say the climate is Anthropocene, what we mean is that humans helped make it, not that humans dominate it or understand it thoroughly. Quite the opposite. Humans had a role in generating the climate as it currently is, but we do not have the transparency of knowledge allowing us to exhaust that reality. We're simply a necessary ingredient in creating the climate. Of course, art has always been this way. Human society has always been this way. Architecture has always been this way. Now, unfortunately, the climate is this way as well. Human is its co-ingredient.
I wonder if we can talk a little bit more about I was interested in some of the very first remarks you made about philosophy and about it not being about reducing something or closing it down or solving something, but rather opening something up and kind of putting something forth, which seems to me to have an extraordinarily strong relationship with the way that artists work and think and what that kind of artistic practice is. And again, for me, thinking about the process, when I was talking at the beginning, this process of making an exhibition like the exhibition downstairs, where rather than starting with a concept or something that you want to elucidate or a statement that you want to make, you're instead trying to follow a circuitous and a series of to follow various different complexities in order to produce something that you weren't even aware you were going to produce, or that, I mean, I've always thought about this kind of curatorial practice as being much closer to the way that an artist works. You know, we all know that the very worst way for an artist to make a work is to know exactly what that work's going to be, to have this kind of very fixed idea of it, and then they do the work and they think, there it is, it's done, and it's exactly what I thought it was going to be. You know, that's the most kind of reductive, boring, and illustrative way of working. And yet, so many group exhibitions are made on exactly those lines. You know, and it's, I think, also to go off subject a little bit here, it's partly to do with the pressure of the art structure and the institutional system, whereby the only way you're going to get somebody to agree to make this exhibition is if you can, 2 years ahead, tell them very clearly exactly what it's about, who's going to be in it, what all of those works mean. And it's almost like you have to have sewn the whole thing up and found a way of speaking and talking and elucidating that 2 years before you even make the show. And so it's a kind of privilege to be able to work this way around, and one that isn't afforded very often, and I think that's a problem. We need to think differently about how we can produce these spaces where you can work like this. And then I think it is very much like, making an exhibition like this is much more about feeling your way and allowing the exhibition as an object, actually, that kind of constellation or array of works to kind of emerge, and some works fall away, and then you have this thing. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, I guess a bit more directly, was in talking around these objects in this way, and talking around artwork. Again, I think what the art world does extraordinarily well is it allows for it allows for the kind of discussions and practices that you can't see being housed anywhere else within kind of academic sciences or humanities. And the art world, for all its faults, is still an incredibly open and generous space for people to come into. It holds a lot of holds these kinds of discussions as well. Mm-hmm. But I wonder, you also made this comment about, you're being invited more by architects and artists to come and speak at the moment. Mm-hmm. And I think the criticism at the moment of some of the kind of object-oriented ontology that you've been so associated with, and even your own work to some extent, is that, to me, it feels like it's because you seem to be doing exactly what artists do, opening these things up and holding them open, but not in a systematic or in a very reductive or it's certainly very rigorous what you're doing, but it keeps open a lot of space there. There are lots of gaps, which to me feel really productive, and what draws me so much to that. And in the way that you write about work as well, objects, their allure. An object can sometimes be encountered flickering at a distance. Mm-hmm. And I wondered how much, in the space between writing some of these things a number of years ago, how much is that something that you think about in the work, or that you're consciously trying to do? And how difficult is it for you as a philosopher and being part of a philosophical community to still resist that somehow?
To resist
to kind of maintain a resistance to reducing something to a much more kind of analytical or resolved, I guess, a resolved state.
Not so difficult. It's more difficult to fend off challenges from people who are making the same complaint you're talking about, I would say. But yeah, I think style is very important to me in philosophy precisely for this reason. Style is a way of making things present that aren't really presentable. Mm-hmm. So you will find, I think, analytic philosophy, which has many, many good points to it, has the weakness that it tends to think of the lack of clarity as being the only problem with bad writing. So they're trying to be as clear as possible, put everything in clearest possible propositional terms. The problem with this is that this is not always the best way to talk about things. Imagine if someone had told Leonardo, why are you using all this stupid chiaroscuro, just paint things in plain broad daylight to make it clear. Well, there are times when shadow is necessary to say certain things, and the same is true in philosophy even. You need to speak in metaphor sometimes, you need to speak in prose that gets at things indirectly rather than directly. And even in Plato's dialogue, Socrates does this. Socrates never gives you a definition. He's always getting at the thing indirectly, sideways. And in a way, this is not really a new idea. This is simply conceptualizing something we always already do. Some of the most powerful language we use is indirect, it's hints.
It's elusive.
Yes. I like giving the example from The Godfather, the famous phrase, an offer you can't refuse. That's a lot scarier than any specific threat. So if Godfather had told the person, if you don't give my friend the part of the movie, I'm going to cut off your horse's head and throw it in your bed at night while you're sleeping. That is a grisly remark, but it's not as scary as an offer you can't refuse. And again, wine criticism. If you switch to Daniel Dennett's kind of wine criticism where it's just chemical formulae, you're losing something, definitely. Something about the pretentious-sounding wine critic's prose is actually somehow closer to the reality of the wine than breaking it down to its chemical compounds. So if you look at some of the greatest writers in the history of philosophy, I would put up there Plato, Nietzsche, Giordano Bruno, some of the best stylists. Some people would say Kierkegaard, it depends. You're going to find that they're not the clearest in the sense that they're not saying, here's what I mean, X is Y, which is the ideal of analytic philosophy. That you're simply supposed to be as clear as possible. I don't think you're supposed to. And I think this is part of why artists and architects have liked what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, some of that is a problem in curatorial practice as well, where everything has to be so clear, and the worst kind of group show, I think, is when a there's a curatorial conceit which is furnished with artworks which are more or less dispendable, and it refutes the inherent potency of the things, and almost prevents or disallows them from making this the thing that we want from art, which is to set forth and hold open that open. And I think in this exhibition, the opposite hopefully is true, that there's like direct relationships being made and drawn, and this kind of haptic language that I spoke about earlier that starts to emerge. So the dialogue's happening between the works outside of the kind of curatorial perspective.
We've talked for an hour. Maybe it's a good opportunity to open it up to the floor and ask if there's any questions. And they can be questions to Graham or Stephen, or if anybody wants to ask anything specifically about the exhibition, whatever. Can you just wait for the mic, David? Thank you.
Thanks. I mean, I already, as you know, sort of feel in sympathy with so many of the sort of ideas that you've kind of talked about, particularly this, the sort of sense of giving objects understood in this kind of complex rather than sort of reductive way, you know, giving them their own life and having this sort of existence independently of certain ways of categorizing and sort of processing experience. But it also makes me, as I tend to do, want to play sort of devil's advocate with myself. And I can't help wondering what the kind of place of certain things which I think get quite usefully bracketed off might actually be. And I think the thing I sort of keep returning to is this idea of the social and the historical, the kind of and the economic, and why it should be seems so kind of appropriate to be having these sorts of thoughts in these sorts of situations, in the kind of situation we find ourselves in now. Because I think it's so rich and it's so liberating to kind of think about objects in their own right and sort of situations in their own right. And I think there's kind of potential to do that in art and philosophy. However, I've yet to come across a sort of an exhibition or an artist or a philosopher who's just kind of emerged independently of some sort of socio-economic and historical situation. So it seems to me there's a real tension in this kind of thinking. I've been sort of thinking of it as almost a kind of an abstract version of sort of ruin lust or something. It's like you're kind of erasing yourself. And all the things that seem kind of close and human from your thoughts, which is hugely kind of there's something really kind of sublime about it. But I also wonder if I could maybe try and sort of fold something sort of social and back into the discussion. So not really a question, but more what I see as something that might be a kind of an absence, maybe a kind of temporary absence in the discussion.
Do you want to say something on that?
Yes. I would not oppose the social and the historical and the biographical being part of a work in any genre. I would just note that history is selective in the sense that any entity, any person, any object only retains a certain part of their history. And that part that they retain, it usually has to be explained in terms of the work. So yes, you can say that if you read Dante's Divine Comedy, you have to know something about Ghibelline politics and how Dante was banished from the city and his views on papal power in the political sphere. So it helps, it's even essential to know those things. But obviously, his work isn't just indiscriminately influenced by everything that's happening around him. You have to show, it takes some work to show which social, historical, biographical things are actually reflected in the work. You can't just indiscriminately say everything's related to everything else, everything infects everything else. Once you understood the work, or once you've focused on the work itself, then you can start asking these questions. How do certain social, political things that were going on at the time influence the work itself? So I think it's too literal. If someone like Greenberg says, you know, Guernica, it's bad that Picasso meant something political with that painting. No, it's not. Obviously, the painting is much enhanced by that, but that may be a special case. It's not necessarily the case that every painting is influenced by its political surroundings, or that every novel is in that way, or philosophy for that matter.
But I think it's implicitly bound into a thing anyway. I think that socio-economic, or the valorization, or a cultural commodification of a thing is part of its object nature. I don't see those things as discrete. I think it's all part of the complexity.
And is it also, though, and I think it's really interesting the point you make, David, and it's something that I've been thinking about and also hearing levelled as a kind of criticism towards this kind of, not just artistic practice, but in speculative realism. But I think maybe it's the case that it does feel almost indulgent or decadent within the kind of the situation that we're living in. And I think your example of ruin lust, this idea of this, you know, kind of highly aestheticized, highly disconnected, sort of sublime experience that we will afford ourselves, it feels decadent in some way. But at the same time, I think it's really, for me, it's not about saying this is the only way we think and we are going to relate to the world. That would kind of collapse into a kind of impossibility. But I think it's really important to be able to think in these ways about objects and stuff and matter, and as well as I think many of us who came through art school or wherever else at the same time were schooled on, you know, kind of structuralism and Marxism and Derrida and linguistics and Lacan and the idea of language and and this feels like in some ways it's a reaction to that. But I think there's. I'm not answering your question. I think it's very
you
interesting.
You are actually
kind
answering
of
it really well. So
I think
and you're reminding me about my art education. So.
Yeah. I recently saw a blog post by Mackenzie Wark, who's a kind of leftist theorist of communication, and he said something in there that I found astonishing. He said, maybe it's not just time to give up on speculative realism, maybe it's time to give up on philosophy as a whole. If philosophy were going to save us, it would have saved us by now. And it shocked me, because who said philosophy was supposed to save us? Does something have to save humanity to be worth doing? Why does no one ask mathematics to save humanity? What he means is that philosophy should be the handmaid of kind of leftist egalitarian politics, and I don't see why that's the case, any more than it should be the handmaid of theology. It's a fairly limited theoretical enterprise, and art is a fairly limited aesthetic enterprise that doesn't need to save the worlds. That seems like very leftover Christianity, this idea that salvation must be what comes from anything worth doing.
That's a messianic. But I mean, thinking about what you were saying, I was thinking about Jenny Holzer and the inclusion of Jenny Holzer, and I was thinking about Virilio. I was thinking about lots of things, but I was thinking about Jenny Holzer's survival series and these aphorisms that are included, and the curious way that they come into being. They're either stickers, they can be very temporal, they can just be words that flicker on a screen, and I think that's something that we really had in mind, especially in relation to Ridley Walker and the use of language in there, and the kind of socio-economic kind of ways that kind of inhabits space and has an effect on objects and our relations and relations. This relational thing that we were talking about earlier. But I think the most obvious use of it was the Haim Steinbeck piece, Yo, and I think that sort of hopefully kind of, for me, is an emblematic of bridging that gap between the kind of discrete nature of objects and the kind of potency of language and the kind of
cultural.
Yeah, I suppose I'll think about that a bit more before.
Thanks. Oh my goodness. I have a question about this idea of understanding work in itself. How do we know when we have understood a work in itself? Is there some kind of external criteria? To what extent does consensus play a role in that? To what extent does the artist's intention play a role? Because that feels like we're heading into a bit of an intentional fallacy. My concern is that we bring a lot of assumptions to a work when we look at it, even when we try to look at it very carefully and very self-critically. So, yes, how do we know when we have understood a work in itself?
I don't think we ever do know that we've understood it, and that's what separates the arts and philosophy from the sciences. Normally, when we think we've understood something, when we understand what it's made of and what it does, whereas my claim is that philosophy and the arts can do neither of those, and so it's always going to be in a position where it's never sure. And even if you read some hardcore realist philosophers of science, they'll say things like, we're trying to get knowledge, and they define knowledge as justified true belief. Well, all we ever know is whether our beliefs are justified based on current experiments. We never know whether it's true. Newton thought his theory of gravity was true as well, and it wasn't. And Einstein's probably isn't true either. So I don't think, obviously historically consensus is what carries the heaviest burden. But what's most interesting is usually the stuff that challenges consensus. And so consensus is usually a great example of what's wrong in the arts or philosophy. So I don't think we ever understand either.
Yeah, I think all you can ask from a thing is that you commune with it, and if something is catalyzed from that encounter and has a greater bearing on the way that we read the world at large, then it starts to operate, and it's operative. It doesn't matter what the viewer has brought to it. It doesn't really matter what the intention of the artist was, really. But all of those things are at play and kind of somehow are encrypted in it. But really, as long as it just kind of has some kind of utility in terms of its kind of being held open and questioning nature rather than actually having some kind of I've forgotten the word, kind of held in some kind of envelope or kind of sealed dialectic. It shouldn't be that. You can't really expect that from a thing.
I think it's precisely as well the idea that there isn't one way of knowing something. That's what I think we've all been trying to think through and talk about in different ways. And I think, for me, again, talking from a curatorial point of view, there's that split between the work and the artist. And so the artist is the person who has this original relationship with the work. They make that work. But as I already sort of talked about a little bit clumsily earlier, perhaps, but it's a direct relationship, but it's not a simply causal relationship. The work emerges out of that artist being in the studio, and then this thing happens. But they have this relationship with this thing that's been made. But then when the thing goes out into the world, for me, that relationship with the artist, particularly in this kind of show, is much less important. And that idea of that artistic intentionality, it's a difficult thing sometimes, but I think to be able to think about the work can have other relationships in other ways, not just with other viewers and people, but with other kind of contexts. And the work moves through time. And we have Robert Morris down there. It's 1968. It's not so long ago. But I was talking to somebody, and they said it's really great to see one of those felt pieces and not see it in a very kind of historicized. Normally when you see that work, you see it in a museum, in the rooms around minimalism, post-minimalism, or you see it in a kind of historic show which is bringing together. And so to be able to treat that thing absolutely on its own terms, and I'm not thinking about it even as a Robert Morris, even though a lot of what he's doing and what those artists were doing, as you've talked about, Graham, is really kind of fascinating as well. But I was just thinking about it, it looks like a kind of weird engine. We had that engine on the floor in there, and here's this other kind of strange engine. It's kind of making itself, it's producing some kind of complexity through its kind of physicality, and it's operating, and it's having this kind of effect in that room on these other things. And yes, it's a Robert Morris from 1968, and it's fantastic to have that in the show, but that's the kind of last bit about it that's interesting to me somehow.
And the other night at dinner, you were talking about Jeff Koons' early vacuum cleaner pieces and how much they've gained as the vacuum cleaners become increasingly obsolete.
Yeah. That was changed utterly. When they were made in 1981, I think, 82, what you were looking at was a vacuum cleaner that he'd bought from a store, that week. And so it was this kind of thing that was absolutely banal, that absolutely disappeared into the world. And that, it was this kind of play on it. You look in a store window and you see the vacuum cleaner, you see the same vacuum cleaner in this vitrine. But now they look like kind of relics, like religious relics almost. And I think that was always there in Koons' intentionality, or certainly I feel it was, that he understood the way you take something out of time. And again, we could talk about this idea of time in many ways, and it's a really important thing in this show. The fossil was a hugely important kind of motif in this exhibition, not just the fossils that Steve's talks about, which we brought in, but also this idea of a kind of contemporary fossil or a kind of future fossil. And those Koons are like kind of future fossil. He kind of pre-fossilizes something, and then the world moves around it, and it's changing constantly.
Well, the Seth Price is another example, because it has the date stamped into it as part of the work. And in these, if you want to think about artworks as kinds of machines, which they are, that the nature of the machine changes to do with its historicalness and its context. And I think that's all, I suppose, what you were talking about with the Anthropocene. That they are dependent very much on this relational kind of to humans, on this relation to humans, but also they modify themselves within that background of context and historical context. It's really weird to watch artworks endure through these changes in or any cultural heirloom really endure through kind of the climate of socio-economic and political change and duration. It's a curious milestone or something, but one that modifies itself and that somehow adapts. And there's also a sort of notion of survival, I think, within the show.
Yep.
The thinking about survival and that kind of tension and the sort of the horror of that temporal existential existence of things and objects and on the edge in some kind of emergency or something, state of emergency. Something like that.
Is there a question over here? No?
I wanted to try and make a comment about something that was a couple of paragraphs previous to this, to do with understanding. I think there's many different wavelengths of thought that are brought to bear to try and illuminate something, and also the objects themselves, as they're decaying, are giving off different wavelengths of information or radiation that can be read in different ways. And so it's a case of inferring from those different wavelengths what you're actually perceiving mentally, I think. If that's clear, or if that's...
Bruno Latour is getting at this in his new work where he has 14 modes of existence, 15 he says, but one of them is not a real mode. There are different kinds of truth. Scientific representation shouldn't have the monopoly for Latour. So there are all those different levels going on for him. That wasn't an answer to your question. I'm just throwing another name into the mix as a possible,
but I think
useful
it's interesting
source.
that kind of, if you think about things that give off a kind of wave pattern and these interference patterns that become complex into a larger kind of tidal arrangement of consequence, and so it means that the whole kind of environment or substrate of is changing subtly. And somehow recording all of that information as well, I think somehow encrypting it into a larger field.
Are there any? Yep, Anthea again. Do you mind waiting for the... It's just because it's being recorded, so then it can be heard on the...
Thank you, me again. I've been thinking about Arthur C. Danto's last book in relation to object-oriented ontology, and particularly his claim that artworks are embodied meanings. And Graham, I wondered if you had any thoughts on this, and what I mean, it's a very enigmatic claim and enigmatic text, but do you think that an object or an artwork can embody its meaning? And I mean, those terms are difficult, I guess, in this context.
Which book was his last book?
It's called What Art Is.
Oh, I've not read that one.
Yeah, okay.
My usual problem with Danto is that he focuses too much on this one idea, which I don't think is quite a major idea. This idea that you can't tell something's an artwork just from looking at it. Well, I would agree with that, but for example, his critique of Greenberg, what he says is that Greenberg's just another person who thought he knew what art was, and now we're in this situation post to that. But that just seems like zeitgeist relativism, as far as I can tell. That nothing, you can't say what anything is, you can't define anything, you can't be an essentialist. You have to make the effort to say what art is. Yes, it's true that the sense of what is art evolves historically, and the Andy Warhol Brillo boxes wouldn't have been considered art even 10 years earlier, I'm sure, even 5 years earlier. But it does not follow from this that art is completely undetachable from all of its surroundings and that everything's related to everything else. So that's my usual gripe with Danto. It seems too pragmatist to me. For me, the artwork is constituted precisely by cutting itself off in some way. That doesn't mean we need to make any a priori decisions about whether politics should be left out or society should be left out, because nothing has to be left out. It's just that not everything is included. You can include political themes in a work. It just simply takes a certain amount of labor to do it the right way so that it doesn't become a piece of propaganda. So if by, I didn't read that particular book, but if by embodied meaning he meant that the art has no reality apart from what it means in a wider context, I would disagree. But I'd have to read this particular book to know if that's what he meant. Sorry. Okay.
Okay, how are we doing on time? We've got time for maybe one more comment or question.
Thanks. I was wondering if you could touch maybe quickly on the idea of how judgment plays into this philosophy and this idea of sort of, I feel like you're touching on this idea of a kind of horizontal hierarchy, maybe? Can you hear me? Okay. Where objects are attributed a kind of equal weight, or at least considered along similar terms. So something like capitalism, something like democracy, something like an event like, maybe even an event like what happened in Paris a few days ago, can be considered a kind of object to be considered, along a similar plane. Right. So where does the role of judgment or critique play into that?
Yeah, a flat ontology, which is the term for treating all objects as equal, obviously can only be the first step. That can't be the whole of your philosophy, or else it's not saying much. You're just saying all objects are equally objects. So the question is how to get from there to one where you're talking about the specific qualities of specific objects and which ones are more important than others. It's also possible to go too far in that direction. So for example, a philosophy like Badiou's, which says there are events and there are situations, nothing in between. And it's very hard to become an event in Badiou's sense. It basically has to be something that transforms the entire planet in a communist way. So I think it's important to do justice to banal everyday situations. But in terms of talking about certain things as being more important or more significant than others, I think art is a good example of this. But the way I define art in things I've written is as the separation of an object from its qualities. And that has a certain place in how I view the history of philosophy as a whole. But it has to do with the separation of an object from its qualities, which normally doesn't happen. And so for me, this is a particular significant kind of thing that happens once in a while. Cause and effect don't always happen. You can have these things sitting here in the same position for hours and nothing will happen. Maybe the water is evaporating a bit, and then once in a while, the table will collapse after 50 years or something. Or an earthquake will happen in Bergen and knock some things onto the floor. In terms of critique, though, usually what critique means for intellectuals is you're standing at some privileged standpoint and judging everything you don't like as an ideology. That's just ideology. The truth is this. And that's the wrong kind of reductionism for me. That's the kind of reductionism that thinks that everything is economic or everything is social or whatever privileged term you take as yours. And it reduces everything to that. But there's another sense of critique, which is that of wine criticism, theater criticism, architecture criticism, art criticism, which precisely don't do that, which are trying to describe the qualities of a thing that are not fully describable. That's the kind of criticism I think we should be doing, rather than saying Dickens thinks he's writing about an orphan boy, but actually he's writing about the capitalist conditions in Victorian England. That quickly becomes too easy, I think. So the object needs to be approached on its own terms with a different sort of critique. A critique that makes things more real rather than less real is another way of putting this. Usually critique is trying to make things less real and saying this is just a mask for something else that's going on. The other kind of critique tries to appreciate the things in the thing that are not fully describable.
And can I just add,
follow-up.
Is there a value to judging something from a human standpoint?
We have to do that, and we make decisions to slaughter bacteria on a regular basis because we care about ourselves. We don't give bacteria equal rights or cockroaches. And Spinoza's take on this was that there's no good or evil there. That if all humans die off, it's great for cockroaches. If we have a nuclear war, it's great news for cockroaches. They're going to evolve into these super beetles over a few thousand years. So we are humans, and so when speculative realism tries to talk about the world apart from humans, sometimes people say speculative realism says humans are worthless. I don't know where that came from. We're not saying humans are worthless, we're just saying humans are not the ontological center of all reality, that other things out there need to be accounted for. But it's fine for us to care more about the fate of humans than to care about the fate of inanimate objects, or that we're not going to allow birds into parliaments. I don't have any problem with this. That's not the right way to bring inanimate objects into the human sphere, I don't think. I think there's always going to be that kind of separation that we make.
Okay. I think we've talked for an hour and a half. It's been a very fascinating and productive conversation for me, so I want to thank, firstly, Graham for coming all of this way and spending a couple of days in Bergen and engaging so generously with the exhibition, so thank you. I want to thank Stephen for his work on the exhibition as the co-curator and for the wonderful exhibition downstairs, and also for agreeing to be part of this conversation. And thank you to all of you for, as I say, braving the weather, which is worsening,
Yes.
and coming out today. So thank you.
Thank you.